Let's begin with the meditation. Okay. There's a few reasons why we are concerned about what's going on in the world today, state of the world. One of these is more emotional in its essence, a natural human concern that we all share. And so part of our spiritual practice is developing an ability to be with the world situation. And that aspect of our path really doesn't depend particularly on our understanding of what's happening or what the outcome will be. Its deepest core is really based on a more universal spiritual principle of cultivating equanimity in all situations, regardless of the particular reality of what's happening on the level of the story of our lives, individually or collectively. So on that level, it's a particularly challenging time to be alive because there's a lot to be concerned about in the world on many different levels. But that aspect of our practice is essentially the same and is the same as what it would be like in any context, in that equanimity is a very universal quality and applies to any situation, whether it's neutral, positive, or negative. So when we approach an exploration of deepening our understanding of what's happening, especially exploring positive scenarios, potentially positive ways of understanding what is actually happening in the world today from a spiritual perspective, we don't want to necessarily have that become something that's a way for us to feel happy about the situation or feel it's not a substitute for equanimity. Equanimity has to ultimately be the foundation of our relationship to the story of our times. Otherwise, they'll always, even if we're in a state of mind where we're successful at, say, talking ourselves into a belief that something very beautiful and extraordinary may be unfolding in our times, if that is how we cope with our human emotional reaction to the challenges of our times, then there'll be a kind of shadow to that. There'll be a background, even if we're successful at fully embracing that scenario, if our motivation is to, as a coping mechanism for the pain that we see around us, then the negative side effect of that is that in the background we'll still be afraid. We'll still be in a state of discomfort and concern and stress and fear. So the only real solution to that issue is to develop as the foundation of our relationship to the world situation a deepening sense of acceptance and equanimity. of course, the essence of that is that it's very much like a spiritual muscle that we develop. We strengthen our equanimity by facing things. An aspect of equanimity is facing difficulty, facing pain, facing fears, facing the shadow of life, facing truths that we're uncomfortable with about ourselves or the world. And so this aspect of equanimity has to do with accepting things, allowing that to be the case. In an ultimate and most radical sense, this is at the core of our whole relationship to reality, that as we grow spiritually, we become more sensitive, we become more compassionate and attuned to the reality of not only our condition, but the world around us. And we discover a truth that in Buddhism is referred to as dukkha, which means we discover that there's a way in which the universe, samsara in Sanskrit, is ultimately going to disappoint you if you invest in it as a way to be happy. If you think of yourselves as separate from the world around you, and that you look for fulfillment through the world around you, as you become more sensitive and awake spiritually, that leads to an inevitable recognition of various truths that lead to an underlying opening, a deepening sensitivity to the reality that it's simply dangerous and unsatisfying and ultimately unfulfilling to look to the dimension of experience that we call samsara, or this dualistic state of self and other, and looking for something outside of ourselves. And so in that sense, one of the most profound levels of what it means to cultivate equanimity is in fact towards the entire story of samsara. We have to stop investing in looking for some kind of positive outcome in that story from a personal point of view. Now we run into a paradox there, because in a spirit of love and bodhisattvahood, we cultivate a caring about the world and a desire to participate in universal awakening. The difference in that orientation, though, relative to ordinary desire, is that we're putting our heart into a place that is more reliable, you might say, in the sense that there's a fundamental way in which, regardless of what type of story is unfolding in the universe around us at any given moment within samsara, there's always a spirit of awakening happening. There's always some place that we can put our energy, even in whether it's the simplicity of our day-to-day lives and just a spirit of blessing and kindness towards all the, even not only the creatures and humans around us, but all forms of life, and even the material world can benefit from a spirit of loving kindness and blessing. So when we enter into that kind of spacious, equanimous love and compassion, we're not becoming attached necessarily to some story of how that's going to work out. And ultimately, the test of our bodhisattvahood, in one sense, is how loving and available to the universe can we be to participate in that awakening and remain deeply equanimous at the same time, and not engage in becoming attached to some specific outcome. We're trying to say, be supportive of somebody that we know. We have to be profoundly equanimous towards what the outcome will be in the next moment, in the next. We know deep down in our hearts, we know that eventually this being will awaken, will become liberated, will overcome suffering, will gain wisdom, but we don't know necessarily what the details of that story will be in the next days and weeks and years ahead. So we have to have this deep equanimity. We have to keep deepening and growing, maturing our ability to care, to participate, to love, and to be spacious and equanimous at the same time. And so the same holds true for our world situation. It's a profound test that we all face in terms of how much can we keep our hearts open and remain at peace and calm and accepting of whatever the outcome might be in our world today. So in one sense, that's our foundational strategy. That's our home base. Then we do what we can, even if it's simply living our lives as consciously as we can, pursuing a spiritual practice. If nothing else, that's our contribution to the world, because our presence as conscious people, however awake we may be, making an effort to grow, makes a contribution to the world. And we might also engage in inner practices that share light and positive energy with the world. We may engage in physical forms of service. And that's a natural human endeavor, and it's a positive way to contribute to the world. And the quality of it will certainly be affected by the depth of our equanimity, the spaciousness of our presence in relationship to the earth, in relationship to humanity. And therefore, of course, on a day-to-day level, in relationship to all the details that we see going on about us with regard to things like politics or the economy or the ecological situation in the world. So that's the foundation. Now, in that context, there's still a reason to seek better understanding of what's happening, because for one reason, for many of us, it will influence informing the decisions we make about how we live our lives. For instance, in my case, the choice to incarnate in the United States is informed by a specific vision, the plan, if you will, held by various bodhisattvas and other spiritual intelligences, even tremendous intelligences that we could call, well, traditionally would be called God, or by some similar kind of word in a more esoteric context. I see some of these beings as simply extraordinarily profound Christ, Buddha-like figures that have, Blavatsky used to call these beings sometimes planetary spirits or solar intelligences. So there's sort of a way of having a more precise understanding. But these beings do participate in our world by holding a vision for intended and hoped for support of the enlightenment of our world. And there's many facets to this vision. There's many different dimensions of this plan that's taking place. Even the existence of the human kingdom in itself is a plan. It's a vision. It's not something that entirely just arose organically, kind of sort of grassroots way, emerging out of matter like modern science would suggest. There's an aspect of that reality, in my experience, that's true, but there's much more dimensions, many more dimensions to the richness of how a human kingdom comes into being. And in many ways, it's something that's clearly envisioned In the same way, for instance, that a person might say, okay, let me see a scenario that we've seen a lot in the last century and a half or so is individuals who may be part of some spiritual lineage in, say, China or Japan or the Middle East, and then they have an inspiration. They come to, say, someplace like France or the United States or Australia, and they specifically decide, I'm going to relocate there, and I'm going to set up a center. And they have a creative spirit, a loving spirit, and they manifest this form, a center. They maybe write books, or they do talks, they develop a staff to run the center. All of this is a conscious plan. Sometimes it unfolds more organically, but nonetheless, they know what they're doing, in the sense that moment to moment they say, well, either choose or don't choose to, say, empower this person to be the general manager of the ashram here or whatever. So in the very same way that something like that takes place in a more immediate human sense, there are tremendous intelligences that look at a planet and make a plan, form an intention to create a human kingdom for precisely the same reasons, as a form for cultivating spiritual development. It's like a big ashram, you might say, and it's intentionally manifested, and it takes the cooperation of a great number of types of lives and millions of beings that participate in this plan. But it's envisioned and it's intentionally created and brought into being. And on any planet, in my experience, on any planet where there's a human kingdom, there's a specific being that is the sponsor, just like my analogy before of a spiritual teacher going to some place and starting an ashram or spiritual community or a center of some sort. Similarly, in a given system or planet like the Earth, where human kingdom, for instance, comes into being, I'm focusing on the human kingdom because we're in human bodies together here. Of course, it's a lot broader context for ways that spiritual evolution is fostered, but to emphasize the human kingdom for the moment, there's a specific being that is you might say, sponsor and authority for that kingdom. Their life force, their presence, their beingness is at the heart of facilitating the emergence of that human kingdom, and they make the decision as to when it is born and when it culminates. And they also implement a plan throughout its existence. And there's larger intelligences that support that being, and there is an infinite host of other intelligences that work and cooperate with that being to create and sustain and ultimately to transform and integrate and conclude a human kingdom. So if we're on a spiritual path, or even as human beings, you see, we're in an odd stage of human evolution on our planet at this point, where we don't really have, as a humanity as a whole, very much awareness at all of anything that I just talked about. Like, where did the human kingdom come from? There's no real significant conscious understanding in the general population of the purpose of the human kingdom, where it came from, what its cycles of expression are, what the goal of the human kingdom is in terms of not only the enlightenment of beings that participate in the human kingdom, but also what are the specific stages. Like, if we were to look at the situation right now, humanity is not collectively saying, okay, here we are in this stage of the unfoldment of the human kingdom, and clearly this is the next step. We should all be collectively working towards that next goal. We are not at that stage in the human kingdom, this human kingdom, just yet, where we're that enlightened, where we even understand our own, the purpose for the existence of our own kingdom. Small number of people have a more advanced understanding. millions of people, of course, understand something basic like we're here to grow, we're here to love each other. This is one of the great things that we see again and again when people have peak experiences, spiritual experiences, for instance, in the context of near-death experiences. We read about people or talk to people who've had near-death experiences. Perhaps we've had one ourselves, and a very common theme is people say that it's powerfully communicated to them that love is at the foundation of our purpose in becoming human. We're here to learn and to express love. So yes, there's that degree of understanding human existence. But much more could be understood, and we will inevitably learn that. But one of the things to understand about a human kingdom, as we cultivate a larger perspective about the human kingdom, one of the things to understand is that there are strong parallels between the way we evolve as individual human beings and the way the collective human kingdom evolves as well. And one of those parallels is that it's an incarnational journey. In other words, the way a human kingdom is intended to evolve is not through one continuous expression, but it reincarnates. Human kingdom comes and goes from material incarnation. It's different. And sometimes these different waves overlap, and sometimes there's gaps between their manifestations. And so in the same way that a human being doesn't necessarily become fully enlightened in a given incarnation, they keep coming back and they grow more and they go through different kinds of experiences, so too a whole human kingdom can not only come into expression, but can pass away without that particular incarnation of humanity achieving any kind of significant spiritual enlightenment objectively in the physical world. Inwardly, the soul of humanity, the soul of individual human beings, and collectively the soul of humanity is always evolving, is always gaining wisdom. So, of course, that's always taking place, but the incarnate aspect of humanity in any given cycle may not, in fact, reach some specific ideal stage of, we might not, say, for instance, come to a point where we're manifesting a civilization that's enlightened, that is basically wiser about the purpose of humanity. Inevitably, all human kingdoms will attain that, will attain collective mastery, collective profound enlightenment. But in any given cycle of evolution of the human kingdom, invariably in many of them, that is not a state that's realized. Now, in any given period of time, there are usually a variety of people that are at many different stages of development. And so we find that there are individuals that are representative examples of the way humanity will be as a whole in the distant future. There are people that are around today that represent more or less what that will be like. They're not actually, in some ways, a full expression of that, because they can't really actualize the deepest, richest versions of enlightenment that's potential in the human kingdom. If the bulk of humanity that they're co-incarnate with during any given cycle are not that awake yet. So every master, every bodhisattva is influenced and conditioned by the overall state of the world. We see this, paralleled in many other ways. For instance, if we look at science, individual scientists can be particularly creative, but they can't just jump, say, 1,000 years ahead of all the other scientists in the world at that time. We can't have somebody, say, 500 years ago, suddenly figuring out string theory or the structure of DNA and scientifically explaining that, and have the other scientists know. They don't have the scientific cultural context to come up with that idea, and then if they tried to express it, no one would understand what they were talking about. So the essence of enlightenment is capable of being realized in any generation. Essence of enlightenment is nirvana, is self-realization, is God consciousness. But the richness of how that is manifested is partially. You can stretch it, and one of the reasons why there are spiritual lineages and communities is to create a context that makes it possible to kind of take enlightenment as far as you can in terms of how it's actualized and the richness of the relative wisdom and knowledge and capacity that you have. But it's still ultimately tied to the general state of humanity. So in essence, though, we do see representatives of various stages of human evolution far in advance of where the average human being is today. But the percentages are pretty small comparatively, and what happens eventually over time through thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution through different cycles, is that humanity as a whole will move into those stages too. So one of the questions that faces us now is, what kind of a cycle are we in now? And where do we stand in this particular moment, and especially with regard to what are the possible next stages of how this could unfold? One of the things I've talked about a bit so far is the notion of a planetary initiation. And this is certainly a possibility in our times. It's not guaranteed that this will happen. And even if it does, it's not a given how that will play out. But it's a moment of opportunity. It's a time period in which it's possible for that to take place. And in many ways, we're already pushing deeply into that process. But there's also, even if a planetary awakening is accomplished in this time period for humanity and the planet as a whole, there's different forms that can take as well. The current plan that I'm attuned to, and many others are as well, more consciously, is still very much working for the optimal outcome of not only having a planetary awakening, that would be a wonderful and profound accomplishment, but having this particular cycle of humanity continue in incarnation for some time after that. But it's not a given. We are at a turning point in this particular sub-cycle of human evolution, of this humanity, where it wouldn't be uncommon for humanity to gradually withdraw from incarnation now and complete this cycle. It's very much along the lines of saying, let's say if a person becomes, they're 70 years old. Many people keep living in these times past 70, but many people might pass away at that time. Maybe they have a health crisis, and in that health crisis, they're working off a lot of karma and they're growing a lot spiritually. The purpose of that health crisis deep down is to transform that karma and to grow spiritually. And so they're in fact fulfilling that purpose as they're doing that, as they're experiencing that. But at the same time, it's possible that they might get through this health crisis and then live another 15 years. That might be uncertain, certainly to the person from their own point of view. They don't know whether that's going to happen or not. If they do leave incarnation at that time, though, that's not necessarily unfortunate, because their whole life could very well have been one of positive growth, and they may have completed that incarnation by suffering a great deal and working off a big piece of karma and growing spiritually, certainly as a soul, and then they leave incarnation. It's quite possible that that's one of the scenarios that we're in the midst of as a human kingdom as a whole. There's a great deal of suffering going on in the world right now. It's as if this particular cycle of humanity is getting towards the later years in its life. It'd be probably more akin to like being in its 50s right now. And it might live for decades to come, but it might not. It might leave incarnation relatively soon. This hasn't been decided yet. It'll depend on the outcome of how humans act in the next century or two. Either way, though, it's a very deeply healing event that's taking place because the karma that's being worked out is a very ancient karma that's been, that I've referred to in the past. Those of you, for instance, who have read my autobiography, that's at the website. In one of the chapters, I think it's chapter 15, I talk about an experience I had back in the 80s, in which I just spontaneously, without concern, I wasn't like it, in other words, I wasn't intentionally trying to have, investigate this topic. In fact, at the time, I really didn't know very much at all about it. I think I bumped into some ideas a little bit, but I didn't know anything about it, and I certainly didn't know details. Suddenly one day, in a particularly profound meditation, I entered an expanded state and experienced a deep awareness of a planetary disaster. I won't go into a lot of details right now. I'm sure many of you have read that chapter, or you could if you would like to. So I'll just keep this short, but the gist of it was that this was a very global event. It wasn't a small, temporary kind of glitch like a world war or something like that. It was a drastic misuse of spiritual energy, psychic energy, that led to a catastrophic disaster. And the experience unfolded in a few different phases, and in the third phase, I was shown that we are in a time now where a tremendous turning point is being reached in healing the karma of that event. This event has had an enormously conditioning effect on the human kingdom ever since then. And this was very, very ancient. We're not talking about something in the last 100,000 years or even several million years. We're talking about very, very ancient event. What I saw was something that was extraordinarily beautiful coming out of that, in the sense of the healing that I spoke of that's unfolding in our times outwardly looks very painful right now, very confusing, very stressful. But nonetheless, this is the way that humans generally work through their karma, is for the most part, even if we seek to be more conscious on a spiritual path, there's still a way in which we tend to not be, fully aware of what is the suffering that I'm going through. If I go through some phase of depression or psychological issues of other sorts, or a disease or hardship in my life, physically, financially, or in some other way, what is the source of this? Most of the time, humans don't know the deeper reasons that have given rise to. That doesn't mean, though, that by suffering through these conditions, especially if we can bring some measure of composure to that, to going through that process, a working out of karma takes place, a healing, a purification is unfolding, and deep in our being, maybe consciously, but certainly in our superconscious self, wisdom is being gained, and ultimately a greater freedom will come karmically and in terms of the depth of our enlightenment through that process. The similar things happening in the world today. There's an enormous amount of pain, yes, but also a great purging and healing is taking place of this ancient karma. So I saw this very vividly. This was a particularly superconscious state in the sense that it wasn't a kind of quiet vision. It was more that my consciousness transformed in such a way that I became one with these events, and my being was in a state of atonement with what was unfolding. I understood it with my whole being. So it had a tremendous impact on me. Clearly, my feeling is some of my higher guides, greater intelligences, wanted me to have this experience, and for a very specific purpose. That not only, there's a variety of reasons why I feel like I was shown that event, but it initiated a process where ever since that time, I've had many other experiences, and also even on a daily basis, just deepening insight and understanding of the way that this event has shaped the evolution of our planet and humanity ever since. It's been a very strongly conditioning factor to the way that life and not just for the human kingdom, but for the planet as a whole, because this was a global event. In fact, later, a few years later, I was reading a book by Marquitas about Daskalos. I think it was actually in the early 90s. And I noticed that Daskalos was also aware of this event and would talk about it periodically. He believed that the planet, the ancient planetary life prior to the disaster, was called Martuk. He said that this was the mantric name of the planet, not a name that humans, for instance, gave to the planet the way we call it, say, Earth. This was more like if you attuned to the vibrational nature of the Earth and rendered it into a speakable word, it would be Martuk, and that this planet was larger than the current Earth is, and humans at that time, very anciently, and a completely different human cycle of evolution than the one we're aware of now, harnessed enormous spiritual or psychic powers, and that these powers were abused to such a degree that they led to a planetary disaster. And people can kind of wonder about that, like, psychic powers, where they seem like they can be conservable, but how could this be? One thing to keep in mind is that any power, for instance, that exists in the physical world is a veiled version of a inner power that's literally the same force, but in a more dynamic and expansive form. So, for instance, if you take a spiritual ability like willpower that you have in your mental body, the capacity to form clear intentions and to focus your your intentionality in a concentrated way and to accomplish things. If you kind of veil your mental body with an emotional body and a physical body, you might still be able to tap into that same willpower, but not to the extent that you can in your mental body if it was freed from those other bodies. Then your willpower is magnified 15-fold. It's much more powerful. It's much more lucid and clear and focused and intentional than it is when it's sort of filtered down into your physical consciousness. So we as human beings can still develop this ability to an extraordinary degree, but it's always more powerful in our cellular bodies. Similarly, in nature, we find powers like nuclear energy. These powers in nature are veiled compared to how powerful they are in the psychonoetic worlds, or the subtle planes, the astral and mental world. There's an astral equivalent to, say, nuclear power, magnetism, electricity, light, all of these types of forces, even, to get more physics oriented, there's terms like the weak force and the strong force and gravity. All of these forces and others unknown to humanity or in the physical world have their inner correspondence, and they're much more powerful there. So if you tap into and release these energies and release them into the physical world, they can be enormously destructive. And so currently, because of this disaster, many ages ago, our capacity as human beings to access this kind of force, this kind of power, has been withdrawn. Humanity no longer has open access to this power. Daskalos, his terminology was, he called this the creative ether. He used the term ether synonymously with, let's say, in China they would say is chi, or in India, prana. It's life force, it's etheric vitality. And etheric vitality or life force or chi has a variety of aspects to it. And some we have some access to. For instance, we can use our imagination to form intentionally an image in our mind consciously. Anytime we consciously do something like, say, I'm going to visualize a triangle in my imagination, we're using etheric vitality on a subtler level and taking that energy and condensing it into a mental form, an image. That's a creative act. And it's a very limited expression of this creative ether. The deeper aspects of creative ether allow us to harness much more powerful energies. For instance, let's say if I wanted to materialize that triangle and bring it down to the physical plane, then we have to tap much more deeply into the creative ether and harness a deeper aspect of it in order to materialize something. Human beings are allowed to have that imaginative form of creative ether, but not such a powerful version that we can say materialize things. And we certainly can't do things like create a life form. We can't visualize a dove and then materialize it and have it be alive and fly away. We can't create a second body that's animated and conscious and infused with a soul, a living being, say, an alternate version of ourselves. It's possible human beings can awaken this, but it's asleep in us. It went to sleep. It was something that was a little bit more prevalent in the human kingdom, perhaps moderately more prevalent in this human kingdom very anciently. And it was abused, and so it was essentially put to sleep. We speak of, say, the Kundalini being asleep at the base of the spine. That's because the Kundalini is another name for this creative ether. Creative ether, you could also say, is sort of a key aspect of the Kundalini. So this is a pretty esoteric subject. We could spend hours just talking about these aspects, these dimensions of this whole issue. But Currently, we don't have access much anywhere near the potential. Just 1% of the creative ether is available to humanity because it was drastically misused. The cause of that misuse is a very mysterious issue too. But I will just say this: that my experience is that it extended beyond the Earth. It was due to imbalances that extended out into the solar system and beyond. There's a dimension of the universe that's simply imperfect. We're all evolving, we're growing in different ways, and there's things that can't be predicted. Energies that sweep through systems on cosmic levels that can throw things out of balance and so on. So in many ways, this was an imbalance. That wasn't something that was just sort of the whimsical effect of people just deciding that they were going. It was something much more deep and esoteric and pervasive that influenced the entire solar system from much larger contexts. This system is much wiser now. The hierarchies that evolve and work with humanity are now hundreds of millions of years more advanced than they were at that time. So Daskalos made an interesting comment too in another one of his, in one of the Marquitas books about Daskalos, one of the earlier ones. There was a conversation taking place about, I think the author, Marquitas, and some others were talking to Daskalos about extraterrestrial life and the way there's life, for instance, within the interior reality of the other planets of our solar system. Some of you will remember in my autobiography talking about beginning to visit some of these worlds in the 1980s, being brought to places like Jupiter. In one instance, by the way, I'll just throw this in as I haven't shared this in the autobiography, but one time a group of us were taken to a planet in the outer rings of our solar system, and we were brought there and introduced to some beings, and one of the things I noticed was a certain hesitation. And some of us in the group were more known and welcomed by these beings, but as a whole, because there were some other members there, and this was their first time making a visit, there was some hesitation on their part. And they didn't say this verbally, but I could sense that they were referencing the Marduk disaster and showing caution, saying we don't want to prematurely energize humans too much for any kind of danger of reawakening these energies prematurely in humanity. This is one of the reasons why people wonder all the time, like they think, Jesus performed miracles relatively openly. And through this, was one of the methods he used to create a kind of demonstration and magnetism that helped people believe in the Dharma, to have faith in him, and to become more attracted to the spiritual path. Why don't thousands of masters just openly demonstrate their powers in the world? One of the main reasons why the spiritual communities of our planet do not do this kind of thing. In fact, you'll find very few books, too. There's only a couple that I'm aware of that are very explicit on how to develop these kinds of psychonoetic or cities, spiritual powers, psychic powers. Generally, the literature is very non-specific about how to develop these abilities. Most traditions that teach them use a kind of created system of only teaching them to people. Like, for instance, Jack Kornfield talks about that in the Theravada Buddhist traditions that he studied in Asia, it was not at all uncommon to be introduced to many of these abilities. But the person always needed to be at least a first-degree initiate. They did not teach people walking in off the street how to manipulate the elements and materialize objects or read people's minds. They first needed to go through a deep character purification and transformation and attain at least the first stage of initiation. And then they begin to introduce them to some of these capacities. And of course, they're sort of relative to your level of development. You can't just immediately, as I say, a first-degree initiate, learn the most advanced abilities. They would be used as an enhancement of bodhisattvahood. You can use these powers wisely to heal others and to serve in different ways. And that's, you have a perfectly legitimate place on the path. In fact, in some ways, they're currently being underemphasized on our planet in many spiritual traditions. Some, for instance, like Zen, speak of them, acknowledge that they exist, and they generally discourage people. In the Sant Mat tradition that I was initiated into in the 1980s, of course, the masters in those traditions have these abilities. They occasionally, even in sort of quiet ways, will use these powers, but they generally discourage their students from focusing on them at all. Then you have other traditions like Daskalos' teachings, or Tibetan Buddhism, or Kundalini Yoga, or the Qigong teachings, where there is a more balanced approach where they're included. But generally, I would say that humanity, the current human spiritual teachings lean in the direction of being cautious about these abilities. And that's because we've been burned. We have a history of abuse of these powers, and very anciently to a catastrophic degree on a global scale. And so there's a tendency to downplay them and discourage people from developing them, certainly prematurely. And a general rule of thumb across most spiritual traditions that they're not to be demonstrated openly in the world. There's a question here about did this event happen in a pre-physical precursor to the Earth? That's not my experience. The particular event or initial experience that awakened in me a very vivid awareness of the reality of this disaster took place or did not include a lot of details like, was this a physical event, or was this a non-physical world where this took place? Was it an astral planet, for instance? Which doesn't make it any less real. The astral world is just as real as the physical world is. But it might not have been a physical. I've considered these things, but in my own investigations, it has felt very much to me like it was a physical event. I did notice too that Daskalos strongly, and other people like Costas, he's referred to in the Markitas books, his name was actually Kikis Christophides. He experienced it as being a physical, incarnate version of the Earth. What Daskalos taught was that the Earth, when it was Marchuk, was larger than our current Earth. Then this disaster happened. It was catastrophic to such an extent that portions of the Earth were scattered outside of the range of the Earth, but some of the fragments after the destruction were caught in the gravitational field of the Earth and gradually coalesced into the Moon. So the Moon was born out of the Earth through this disaster. Alice Bailey, incidentally, is another person who has talked, perhaps more than anybody publicly that I've seen so far, about, she calls it the moon chain disaster. Moon chain is a theosophical term that was used originally by Blavatsky. It was picked up by later writers like Leadbeater and Besant and subsequently Alice Bailey and numerous others. It's a way of talking about cycles of evolution on the Earth. Without getting into the details, it's a pretty complicated system. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it to some extent. It's kind of a westernized, modern version in terms of terminology of concepts that come from, that usually have names in the Eastern traditions, like yugas. We've all heard of the things like the Kali Yuga and the Satya Yuga. These are particular cycles, but they take place within larger cycles, manvantaras, and this kind of thing. So the concept of chains is just a modern version of that that concept. Okay. And chains are one of the most general versions of the cycles. There's 7 cycles that are called. Each one is a chain. There's a first chain and a second chain. So these can be billions of years long or hundreds of millions of years long. These are very long evolutionary cycles. And it's taught by some of the masters that gave this knowledge to Blavatsky from the Trans-Himalayan lineage of planetary bodhisattvas, that we're currently about halfway through the evolutionary cycles of Earth's evolution and in the middle of the 4th chain. And that it was during the 3rd chain, which was a very long time ago, a cycle like when people talk about modern terms like Atlantis, Plato talked about Atlantis. These are very small cycles compared to chains. Chains are hugely longer than a root race or yugas or any of these ideas. So that was a very long time ago. There are passages in some of Alice Bailey's writings where she goes into some detail, particularly in a book called A Treatise on Cosmic Fire. And I found that after many years of having my initial experience and then lots of other meditative experiences, particularly in insights that arose in other contexts, I eventually happened to run across this passage in this Alice Bailey book, and I found it remarkably similar to what I had experienced. There was a lot of details. They not only dovetailed strongly with what Daskalos had shared, but they had some very esoteric and interesting details that fit very closely to what I had been learning about the experience as well. And she too says that it was a physical event that happened to the Earth. So that's kind of, in a nutshell. I don't want to dwell on this too long right now. The main reason I'm bringing it up is because, for 2 reasons. It's very important to really have an understanding of our human kingdom and the state of our planet right now. It's actually very illuminating to have some awareness that this thing happened in our past. It's similar to, let's say if a person went through a trauma when they were 5 years old, very traumatic, say, event, and then they repress that memory. And so they go on with their lives and they find that, there's ways in which they feel different. This wound isn't fully healed and it influences their life. And suddenly they are somehow made aware, they become aware again that this happened. And it's an aha moment because it explains a lot of things. It's suddenly they can understand a key element of why their life has taken the way, the direction that it has, and some of the implications of this trauma that they went through. This moon chain or Marduk disaster, I feel, was a key karmic moment in the history of our planet. It's the type of event that's not, it does, things like this can of course happen, but it's not normal, let's say, for a planet and a humanity to go through something like that. And so it's very illuminating to humanity, and it's very key in terms of the great ones that work with our planet and work with its evolution. It's a key mystery to comprehend something about in order to really have a proper context for understanding. For instance, one of the things that we have generally no context for understanding, but I feel that is true from my experiences, that normally human beings evolve in a way where our spiritual awareness and our creative power, our access even to this thing that Daskal has called creative ether, the Shakti energy, unfolds in such a way that they're more balanced, and we incarnate as a human kingdom more gradually. And so normally, when a human kingdom emerges in the physical world, as ours did hundreds of thousands of years ago, we maintain more of this creative ether, and we maintain more awareness of our past as spiritual beings. The fact, though, that we are incarnated in these types of animal forms, that we derive from the primate kingdoms, and that we don't remember, even in any given lifetime, we don't remember usually what happened before this incarnation. We don't remember why we're here. We don't remember the purpose of being, and we don't have access to the creative ether. These are all a result of the Marduk disaster. This isn't the normal way that a human kingdom is experienced. And so the healing of that will have tremendous implications. It moves us dramatically back in the direction of restoring a more natural and normal form of human experience. So even if some of the pain and chaos that's the result of that event having taken place, and it's kind of playing out in the world again right now, even if we can't fully restore and bring balance to our human kingdom, we're accomplishing a great healing process right now. We have been for thousands of years, and it's reaching a culmination. And that in itself is a great accomplishment. One of the things that I saw in the initial experience, the superconscious state back in the 80s, was I first experienced the event itself. And it wasn't from a distance. I entered a state of oneness with planetary consciousness that allowed me to feel the memory of that event through my whole being and all of its, the emotional reaction within humanity, the horror, the sorrow, just the full intensity of that disaster flowed through me. And then I moved forward to a period where I saw that a new cycle of human evolution had happened, and a new humanity, not the Marduk group, a new humanity had been born in another cycle much later on the earth. And then in the middle of that cycle, I could see that the souls from the moon chain, or Marduk, were being brought into incarnation and merged into this new cycle of humans, so that we ended up with a hybrid group that was a new group that had nothing to do with Marduk, and yet we're still, affected by the Marduk karma. And then the actual souls, there's still millions of souls from Marduk that need to continue their evolution. So what we have in the world today, hundreds of thousands of years later, is a blend of souls that were actively involved in Marduk and souls that arose and became humans much later after that, and are part of another cycle of humanity. So we have so I saw that merging taking place, and the reincarnation in a later cycle of these ancient souls that were part of that old cycle. And then suddenly the vision jumped to a third phase where I saw that in our times an extraordinary healing was taking place. And it was actually amazing. I was filled with a sense of enormous joy and bliss. And it was ecstatic, in fact, to witness this process of this healing taking place. In the physical world, it doesn't feel like that. It feels very painful and struggleful, but I saw in the soul of humanity, there was a great freedom and a great expansion going on. And I saw that it had the potential. Suddenly, as this healing unfolded, I saw the earth beginning to radiate spiritual luminosity. And it was like it was like a hum. It was as if you, in a sense, I would say that at the time, it was a very pure intuitive experience. There weren't words or concepts involved. If afterwards I would have put words and concepts on it, I would say that the creative ether was being restored. Planetary Kundalini was awakening. And this energy was enlivening the earth. There was a great vitality waking up in the earth, a kind of enlivening of all life on the planet, not just humanity. So whatever amount of that is accomplished in our times, it's still a success. That is my fundamental intuitive sense of the reality of our times, is that as painful as it is, there's a great healing that's happening. And however far we get with it, it's still an enormous accomplishment, because this is a very difficult karmic past that we're dealing with. We've reached the stage of ripeness to open to a much more kind of critical turning point in the process of healing that, and that we are in the midst of that even now. That is unfolding in our times. And that alone is a very positive reality. It doesn't even specifically need to make reference to where will we be in 1,000 years or 10,000 years. It's an accomplishment that that's happening right now, as painful as that is. Okay, so should probably why don't we take our break now, and then we'll come back in 10 minutes and have another meditation. Okay, let's have a meditation now. There's a number of questions, by the way, that continue to come in, and I'm not ignoring those. I'm going to integrate those in as we go. So we'll come back to those later. But for now, let's go within. Let's begin by settling in. Letting the mind calm down. Feel your body as a whole. As you feel your body, feel your breath. As you exhale, feel your body relaxing more and more. The mind settling down. So your body surrounded by a field of light, a kind of egg-shaped white light surrounds and permeates your whole body. Feel your body nurtured by this light. Know that you're surrounded by spiritual intelligences that nurture your bodies, maintaining and healing them. And that by visualizing your body surrounded by light, you cooperate with them, enhancing their ability to keep your bodies healthy, balanced, in harmony. Wish good health to your physical body. Give thanks to the support you're receiving. And wish harmony and wholeness to your personality as a whole. Now feel your consciousness becoming more subtle and spacious. Feel yourself expanding, that you can look at your body from a distance. See the building that you're in from a greater altitude. Let your consciousness continue to rise and expand. You can see the countryside. The whole region. The country as a whole that you're a part of. Until you expand enough that you can see the entire Earth in space. Now visualize the earth surrounded by a sphere of luminosity, of warm and radiant white light. And view this light with a soothing, healing quality. Know too that when you visualize this light, it strengthens the ability of a whole host of greater intelligences to help and support the healing and transformation of the earth. Looking more closely at the earth, seeing it bathed in white light, notice an intricate web of lines of light surrounding the earth, a grid of light. This is a grid of light that already exists. See if you can sense its presence. This pattern of light, this grid surrounding the earth, has a protective function. Form the intention that when you visualize this field of light, it can be used by spiritual intelligences to strengthen this grid. At the same time as you see this field of white light, and the way it helps also to strengthen the grid of light surrounding the earth. I also see a blue light surrounding the earth as well. This is in addition to the white light. This blue light has a soothing quality, calming, peaceful. Wish that love and peace continue to grow on earth. Sense many, many spiritual lives surrounding the earth and within the earth, seeking to help the earth evolve and heal. Give thanks for this support. Feel yourself moving back towards your physical body. Entering more and more into your physical body, incarnating, inhabiting your body more consciously. Feel your body fully. Feel your presence in the physical world around you. Feel your contact with the surface upon which your body rests. And when ready, open your eyes. Although it's important to have a larger context in our times of a deep equanimity about the world situation, I feel that there is a lot of reason for hope about the continued expression of our current humanity. This is something that I not only gain strong support for in my own inner experience and have throughout my life. Frankly, I wasn't very hopeful or optimistic person when I was a teenager. Like a lot of teenagers, I had my pain and issues and some cynicism, but because of some shifts into a more spiritual direction, and then especially some of the spiritual experiences I started to undergo in my 20s, that shifted. But it also, at the same time, was paralleled with a deepened and continually deepening appreciation for the challenges of our times. So it's kind of like a dual vision, a strong and grounded appreciation for the karmic challenges and conditions of our humanity in the world, of which these ancient karmic realities that I've been speaking to are part of. But there's much more, of course, to our planet's history than just that. But also a very heightened and deepening sense of the challenges we face in the world, but always at the same time balanced with this other spiritual dimension. Of course, I've also, as have many of us, developed an ongoing interest in comparing my experiences to what other people are experiencing. I found some very strong resonance with a wide variety of different people from all different backgrounds and orientations. Some of my strong initial connections were with the kind of ancient teachings that were coming through modern sources like Theosophy. And then I began to have direct experience of that lineage and a kind of influx of my own intuitions that continue to this day. But there's still much in that tradition that I resonate with. And I've noticed too that one could, these plans that masters have, for instance, and the way they understand the world situation can transform over time too. There's an adopting that goes on. An example of this comes from David Spangler, who, for those who know anything about David Spangler, who's alive today, he is a wonderful American mystic who has experienced a strong inner cooperation with a spiritual community that overlaps very closely with my own. And that began for him in his late teens, and a primary contact with the being that he simply calls John, not because of any specific reference. It's not necessarily somebody like John the Evangelist or any other famous John. He simply just calls him John because he likes the name. And John came to Spangler one time in a meditation in January of 1980, and gave him some forecasts of what would be happening in the Soviet Union over the next decade. This was somewhat unusual for John because he didn't that often give prophecies, but he said that the then premier of the Soviet Union would soon die. An interim individual would take over. I think that was Andropov. And then he showed him an image of another man who would come into power shortly after that, and that this person would help to bring about sweeping changes in the Soviet Union, which would ultimately lead to its transformation. Spengler then turned to a friend of his after this experience, who was a specialist in the Soviet Union, and asked him if, told him about the experience, and his friend got out a book that showed a lot of pictures of characters, and there was one individual who was not a person well known in the West, Gorbachev, and at that time he was not a famous figure in the United States, and Spengler picked him out and says, yes, that's the man that John showed me would be coming into power in several years and helped to bring about sweeping changes. Now, part of the experience, John also said that right after that, sweeping changes would happen in the United States. And that didn't happen. And so years later, when Spengler had an opportunity, asked John, what happened with, part 2 of that prophecy? And John said, unexpected things happen, and that those changes are delayed. They didn't take place in the 90s and thereafter as expected. And this I bring up just as an example of that there's a lot of flux in what's happening. So there's plans that are implemented, but they also have to be modified regularly. And it's not to say there's actually some good reasons why those changes didn't happen at the time. I won't go in, that's a whole nother conversation. Perhaps we'll talk about that in a subsequent meeting, but to keep this on focus for the moment, there's a need to adapt. So we can go back, for instance, and say, well, what about some of the plans that have been talked about over 100 years ago, like in the early theosophical teachings? Blavatsky talked about these 2 main masters that wrote the Secret Doctrine with her. They were essentially the authors of the Secret Doctrine, Kuthumi and Maurya. It's well known in theosophical circles that these are the actual authors of the Secret Doctrine. They used to even, as some of you may know, they would inhabit Blavatsky's bodies and then write in either a blue pencil or a red pencil. If it was Maurya, he would write in red, and if it was Kuthumi, he'd write in blue. Write through the night, scribbling pages and throwing them on the floor, and people would gather them up and put them in order the next day and transcribe them. So there was this fascinating and interesting effort by some of these masters in the late 1880s to share some of the vision, not only of the history of our planet, but mainly this particular cycle that we're in of the last several 100,000 to a few million years was what was covered, but also what's happening now. And one of the things they talked about at that time was that there are smaller cycles that last, relative to our time period, they're very long, but they're small compared to the age of the Earth as a whole. And that they also unfold in patterns of 7, and that we're in the middle of the 5th sub-cycle of the 5th larger cycle. In other words, if we have, the term that was used then was root races, and these were given names from some popular teachings at the time. They're not called this in the East, but this is what the terms that were adopted were: Atlantis and Lemurian. These are very, relatively long cycles, and we're in the 5th one of these, the 5th root race, according to the theosophical teachings that were given to Blavatsky by these masters. And we're in the 5th subrace, which was a European-based subrace. That's where it was. The 5th subrace was spawned. The first subrace of the fifth whole cycle of human incarnation was started in India tens of thousands of years ago. And we're in the fifth now, which is not to say that all the other parts of humanity don't matter, but it's kind of like, where's the sort of cultural shift focused at that time? Sort of like a chakra, an energy focus that can move around. And the plan that was described at that time was that the sixth subrace would soon be emerging, was actually already beginning in North America. And not only would the sixth subrace emerge in North America in this time period starting centuries ago and take going forward centuries, so we're in the middle of the emergence of the sixth subrace. But further, the sixth root race, which is a whole nother larger event, would emerge also in North America sometime after that. So that's interesting. Who's to say, the significance of that plan? Many people have resonated with these kind of visions and wonder if that's at least one of the lenses, one of the ways of understanding what's happening in the world. But you could also ask the question, well, plans change, like where are we at in that process? Is that still on target? Is it still moving forward? Well, interestingly, just to sort of show you how pieces come out from different points of view, I certainly have my own input, but I like to share, pieces from other points of view just to sort of round out and suggest, I'm not operating in a vacuum here where everything that I'm sharing is just my point of view. There are other people around that resonate in one form or another with different parts of what I'm experiencing as well. But as far as kind of wondering, well, is that plan still happening? Well, from a completely different and unexpected source. Recently, some of you may be aware that there's a woman in Ireland named Lorna Byrne, who is not particularly an esotericist in the sense that she isn't a Tibetan Buddhist or a Rosicrucian or a Theosophist or anything like that. In fact, she's relatively unread. She's very dyslexic and so has never really been able to read very well. Can't even really write very well. So all of her experiences come from her clairvoyant and intuitive experiences of interacting with archangelic intelligences, which she has seen since birth. She sees them with exceptional clarity, has the same kind of personal rapport with them that humans ordinarily have with each other. She sees them clairvoyantly with extraordinary detail and can hear them clairaudiently, the same kind of clarity that humans have. They even, in fact, physically materialize to her sometimes, and she's actually been seen walking down the street with Archangel Michael standing next to her. People just see him as an ordinary human dressed in, a leather jacket and jeans, and they'll say to her later, well, who is that fellow? I saw you, who's your new friend? And she was aware that he was there, but she didn't know that anybody else could see him. She didn't know he was that materialized. And that happens periodically. So she has daily contact with these kinds of superintelligences and has for over, since she was born. She saw them as an infant. She grew up. She was essentially raised by these beings. And they share all kinds of things with her. And what's kind of fascinating about her is that she's completely unsophisticated when it comes to reading or exposure to anybody else's points of view. She lived completely in isolation in the sense that nobody around her until she was in her 20s had any idea that she was having these experiences. And so what she has understood through these relationships was completely untainted by any kind of intellectual knowledge that she gained from talking with people or reading. And one of the things that they told her was that for a number of centuries, the United States had been planned by a being that she calls God. I would call it something else like the Logos or use some other term, personal preferences. She just calls this being God, who's one of the beings that she interacts with. And she said that over the last several centuries, this being has cultivated the United States as the emergence of a new race, as she calls it. That a new consciousness and a new form of humanity will be in the process of being born. And she says that, for instance, that there's a whole host of archangelic beings that were created by the Logos, God, to what she says the archangels call them gathering angels, and they, for centuries, have gone around the world and worked from the inner dimensions to orchestrate collecting different people to have them move to the United States and contribute to the development of the new humanity and the new consciousness that's being born here. Now, this is basically similar to what Theosophists were saying over 100 years ago. She adds, additional details like the concept of gathering angels. But one could say, well, this is something that the masters had in the works, obviously for centuries going back before. There's other sources that talk about that as well. There's just as a random example, there's a fascinating initiate named Wittmann, who was an American also. He lived during the early and mid part of the 20th century. He was a forest ranger, and he came out of the forests and saw a flyer for a talk on the Bhagavad Gita by an Indian master named Mazumdar, who was traveling in the United States in the 1920s giving talks. So he went to the lecture, and Mazumdar saw him and jumped down off the stage and walked right up to him and said, "Where have you been? I've been working on the inner levels for 2 years to get you to come out of the woods and find me so I can begin the training. I've been sent by my master to the United States to find you and to train you and awaken you." So then began his discipleship, and over a 7-year period, he raised his Kundalini to the crown center and attained and grounded the third initiation, and then began his teaching career. And Wittmann says that those two masters above him in the lineage, Mazumdar and Arumda, specifically were part of an understanding that they were beginning to transfer energy to the United States, because, as one of them put it, the United States is the new India. It's the place where over the next centuries and thousands of years, a new spiritual presence will be focalized in planetary evolution. And the same way India has held that energy for tens of thousands of years, a shift will be happening in this way. So there's dozens of references like this that I could go on sharing, but these are some. And just as recently as in the last 10 years, not only have people like Karen and I been experiencing the same thing, Spangler talks about this, many others, but even Lorna, as an Irish person, and she says, I know a lot of non-Americans aren't going to be happy about what I'm saying, but this is what the archangels are telling me is happening, is that there's something unusual happening in the United States right now, and new consciousness is being born. Now, this creates a kind of a paradox, because we look at things like the political situation or the presence of a spirit of imperialism and greed that's so rampant in the United States, and try to, how do we mix these two ideas? How could a new consciousness be born here? Now, that's a big topic. But one of the ways to understand that is, often spiritual emergence doesn't happen from the most advanced or growing tip of an individual, even much less, say, a larger group. It happens in a place where there's a kind of collision between fundamental forces. What the United States really is not a cutting edge place in terms of the most mature political or economic or cultural elements. Some elements of that are happening here, but it's really a place where there's a tremendous collision of forces within the human kingdom, forces of light and darkness, a struggle to sort of integrate, to mature, to learn, and so it's in the midst of that creative dynamic struggle that this new consciousness is being born. And it will take centuries for it to come into expression. One of the reasons I brought up Lorna, if you haven't heard of her, she's a wonderful soul, a very special and fascinating to me individual. But in her own very simple and unsophisticated way, she's speaking to the same kind of things that, you pick up a book like The Secret Doctrine, and it's extremely technical, it's very complex. A lot of theosophists even struggle to comprehend a lot of what's in it. And here's Lorna in her own very simple way saying some of the same ideas that you find in The Secret Doctrine, including many others as well. She speaks about the nature of the human kingdom, how it's different than the angelic kingdoms, and what the angels have taught her about that, and so on. But another reason I brought her up is because she's reaffirming the idea that this plan is still in motion, even in this moment in time. This is something that is being fueled, and this is cause for hope. In a sense, if we had already reached that turning point where a decision had been made that, okay, this is not likely to be able to be healed and shifted in such a way that, say, humanity will continue on for many thousands or tens of thousands of years. It's kind of the completion of a cycle. It's important to be equanimous towards that possibility. And Lorna incidentally talked about that too in one of her visions that was very uncomfortable for her. I believe it was Archangel Michael showed her that it was a definite possibility that God or the Logos was considering to relatively soon gradually withdraw humanity from incarnation. Lorna incidentally has been shown a wide variety of visions, some more catastrophic and some very positive about what the potential outcomes of our current situation are. And one of them is that that God is considering the option of just completing the cycle and gradually phasing out the human kingdom. Another, just for this cycle though, it's a birth. It's like completing a human incarnation. It isn't the end, the soul continues on. Another interesting source of that same idea, by the way, which resonates with things that I've experienced as well, and Karen, is another fellow, another American, Robert Monroe, who I'm sure some of you have heard of. He passed away a few decades ago. The 1 minute version of his story, for those of you who are unfamiliar with him, is he is a very successful businessman who was exploring forms of use of hypnosis back in the 50s to accelerate his learning. This was very creative, very grounded, very intelligent, and successful entrepreneur and business person. But he was also interested in expanding himself, so he was exploring hypnosis. And long story short, it led to him to start having spontaneous out-of-body experiences, and he didn't know what was causing them. He didn't even know what they were. He wondered if he was losing his mind. But over the course of the next, between about maybe 1958 and 1970, he had thousands of these experiences. And he got used to it. He came to realize that he was functional in this dimension. He learned how to do it himself. At first, they were happening spontaneously. And he would experiment. He would do things like he'd go across the country. He lived in Virginia. He'd go to, say, California and visit his sister on the astral plane. He'd watch what she was doing. And she'd be like in the kitchen cooking a specific meal. And he'd go back to his body and then he'd call her and say, "What were you doing just now?" And then she would explain, and he would realize, well, that was real. That's exactly what I saw her doing. But after 10 or 15 years of doing this, all kinds of things, he was experimenting in different ways. He realized that it was kind of getting boring and he wasn't really getting that much out of it anymore. So he thought, if there's some way that I can have some greater value, what could I do? How could I evoke that? So he he just he went out of his body and he sort of made an invocation to the universe. He said, if there's any beings around that could help me to grow spiritually and make more of these experiences. And of course, there's a profound spiritual principle, ask and you receive. Immediately, Master showed up and began to guide his journey after that, and that changed everything. It was a complete change in the types of experiences that he was having, and his whole spiritual growth accelerated considerably after that. The reason I brought him up is because you can read some of the books that he's written, and he recounts hundreds of experiences that he had. But one was that on one occasion, he was in one of the higher dimensions. He had his own, like Lorna, he had no training in spiritual teachings or esotericism or anything, so he didn't use particular terms like, Bhuvar Loka, or the astral plane or any of these words. He would just say, well, I went to, the next dimension, locale 2, this is locale 1, so that's locale 2. He just sort of made up words like this. And, he went to one of the specific dimensions that he had a name for. He was brought there by a guide. He was brought into a higher dimension, much like one of my experiences. I don't remember what chapter it's in. Probably chapter 13, maybe in the book. He was brought into a place that was a lot like outer space, and he was looking at the Earth from a distance. And there were a lot of other beings around. All of these are similar to my experience, by the way. And one of the things that this being that he was with, this master, pointed out was that there were lots of other beings there watching the Earth. And so they had a name for it. They called it the Gathering, because there were large numbers of beings from other systems just watching what was happening on the Earth right now. This, by the way, this happened during the 1980s. So Monroe asked this master, what am I seeing here? Something, it feels like we're watching something dramatic happening to the Earth right now. And he said, yeah. The reason that there's this huge gathering is that there's something profoundly unusual happening to the Earth right now. In fact, the opportunity that is available to the Earth for awakening only happens at this level of intensity every 87 million years. 87 million years is the period of opportunity that this specific moment in planetary history is affords us. And he described how there was a large kind of lining up of cosmic influences that are bringing this opportunity into, manifestation. And Monroe asked him, well, what, is this going to, is it definite that this is going to happen? And he said, well, it's definitely going to happen. That we've already passed that point that something's going to happen as a result of this. It's still up in the air, though, what the outcome will be. And it could range from an extraordinary moment of planetary awakening to, at the other end of the spectrum, kind of a missed opportunity. And so then Monroe asked him, well, what if it's a missed opportunity? What will happen then? And he said, very likely humanity will gradually be withdrawn from incarnation. And then Monroe said, well, what would you do then? And he said, well, we'll just start again another time. This isn't over. This is just a particular cycle. And Monroe was kind of disturbed by that. He found that emotionally shocking to consider the possibility that we may be nearing the end of this whole cycle of human evolution. But in fact, this is the way it's spoken of in the Secret Doctrine as well. They talk about in these various root races and sub-races that happen, there are times when cycles are just brought to an end for various reasons. And again, like I said, Lorna made reference to that. She was told the same thing. And this is something that Karen and I have experienced too. So we have to be open to that possibility. At the same time, my experience is that the basic plans that have been, and it's multifaceted, and the subsequent sessions will we'll talk more about all these various details. At the moment, I'm speaking particularly about things like the way the United States is being kind of groomed and used as a focal point for the birthing of a new consciousness. That clearly is still underway. It's why Karen and I incarnated in the United States. Many other people have come here for the same reason. Incidentally, that doesn't mean that there isn't tremendous spiritual activity throughout the world. And there's a multifaceted focus of planetary emergence throughout the world. We can even look at ancient places like India, which seeded this major cycle, so-called root race, many, many thousands of years ago. And there is still huge focus of spiritual energy there and great transformation in culture. You can, it's fascinating to go on the internet or whatever, or watch a movie and see the way Indian culture is transforming and how much there is a kind of blending of different influences happening in India. So even in some of these ancient cultures in Africa, in South and Central America, in Europe, in the Middle East, there's sweeping changes throughout the world. So when we talk about a way in which there's a focalization in America, that is not in any way to suggest that this presence isn't happening throughout the planet in all kinds of different ways. But there's a specific kind of focus of intensity, a kind of a battleground, you might say, of the interaction of different dynamic energies in North America right now that's very intense and is sort of a birthplace, a kind of fiery birthing focal point for this emergence. Okay, let me pause for a second and catch up with looking at some of the questions here. Sounds good. Could the new consciousness developing in the US be due to the understanding of theosophy that the sixth subrace, multi-ethnical, of the fifth root race is being formed in the US and Australia and will at some point in the future form the basis of the sixth race? Well, the short answer to that is yes, that's my feeling. In fact, there's a woman named Hilda Charlton who was a student of some of these masters in the mid to late 20th century. She was particularly a student of Hilarion, but also of Jesus and some of the other masters. And she channeled a book by Hilarion back in, I think, maybe the 80s. And Hilarion initiated the book by talking about how extreme the crisis we're in and how dangerous and precarious the situation is in terms of like really embracing the opportunity of moving forward. But then he shared, well, Hilda actually talked about an interesting event that happened to her when she was growing up. She said as a teenager, she didn't really know anything about spirituality, and her folks weren't particularly interested in spirituality. One day she went to the bookshelf in her house, and she found a book written by Hilarion on the bookshelf. And this wasn't a book that was like available in print. She just found this book in her house on the bookshelf. She read the book. It kind of became her Bible for a while. She carried it everywhere and she read it many, many times. And then suddenly one day it disappeared, never to be found again. And then later she made inner contact with Hilarion and she realized that this was something he had provided for her early stages of her spiritual awakening. And in this book, she said that Hilarion described how the central plan for humanity is that the races, the different genetic racial types and the different colored, the skin coloration differences and everything, gradually will be harmonized into a single racial type, a unified humanity that will have a kind of golden colored skin in the future, and that this will arise over many centuries and millennia. And that, in a sense, it's kind of like we've gone through an individualization period where facets of human nature have been cultivated equally with each of their values in different parts of the world. And part of what North America is seeding is that, it's been called for centuries a melting pot, both racially, culturally, and now spiritually. It's a place where there's a blending starting, and this blending will pervade the entire human kingdom over the millennia that come. And so these plans are still in the works, and they kind of relate to the theosophical concept of root races and so on. But they're also part of a new archetype. This is something we don't have time to talk about more today. I've talked about a little bit in the past. But in order to have a better understanding of the plan, we need to go a little bit deeper into the notion of what do we mean by a new consciousness being born in the world? What is the, is there really anything new? Like, one of the concepts that we find in a lot of spiritual traditions is maybe you can have old wine in new bottles, but essentially that wine is the same. It's the Dharma. It's the same understanding that's been around for thousands of years. And then there's a way in which that's true. But in my experience, there's also really two aspects to enlightenment, two aspects to spiritual realization and beingness. One aspect is that aspect that opens to the eternal, to the infinite, to the transcendent, that reaches beyond words, beyond concepts. And it's that aspect that is eternal. But the other aspect of enlightenment is that it participates in time. For instance, even the notion of going through an enlightenment experience is something that we talk about as happening in time. We go from a state of being less enlightened to more enlightened. There's a story there. So as soon as you've entered into the whole concept of a story of enlightenment, you're participating in time and relativity. And at that level, there's more than one form of enlightenment. It's not all just one thing. There's different points of view, there's different flavors, there's different perspectives, and we could even say archetypes. What I mean by an archetype is there's like, for instance, an example of what I mean is, I've spoken before about the notion of ascending spirituality. A basic archetype, a basic point of view that influences spiritual understanding in many spiritual traditions and has for thousands of years, is a notion that the spirit is better experienced in higher worlds. And so the basic aspect of our spiritual journey is to move our consciousness away from the physical world and move towards subtler dimensions. It could be called an ascending spirituality, because we're ascending through some concept of worlds or planes or levels of reality back to God, back to our true nature. That's a specific archetype. That's a basic story, a basic understanding of an aspect of what spiritual enlightenment means. And of course, it's not the only point of view. So one way of talking about what the new consciousness is it's a new archetype. And I would argue it's actually, there's aspects of it that actually have really never been understood before on this planet. No master that I'm aware of, at least those that have expressed in ways in the world like the Buddha or Lao Tse or Shankara or Jesus, have expressed this understanding in a way that we can look back at historically and say, this is what so-and-so said. My experience is there isn't really any significant teaching that's been given out in the world that points to this new archetype that's emerging. It's a new spirituality, a new way of understanding human nature, life, the existence of the universe, and ultimately just the true nature of reality. I saw a question pop up. Thank you. So I'm going to pause there. We're coming to the end, but I want to see if there's any questions before, let's see, I will unmute everybody now in case anybody wants to put in a question verbally as opposed to the chat. I think I've covered a lot of the questions that came up. If there's any that I missed, feel free to repeat them now or draw my attention to them. Okay. Yes, I assume, Patrick, that you mean the event like this ancient planetary disaster. Yes. Yes, it does. The question is, in case anybody hasn't seen it, is this event a part of why the feminine life is hidden from humanity, or is that a later reason? Yeah, actually, that's a huge question and a very good one. So what I'm gonna do right now is give a shorter answer because there could be a 2-hour answer to that question. So I'll give the the short version now. So yes, to begin with. One of the many ways of understanding that is this. We talk about two basic aspects of human nature. Mind and body, for instance, or to use the Hindu imagery, the archetypal imagery of Shiva and Shakti. Shiva is more connected to mind. It's like the essence of mind, the pure consciousness, the observer, the equanimous witness. Like often, even Shiva as personified as a deity is imagined as like a yogi on a mountaintop sitting in the lotus position in profound equanimity, just witnessing the arising of the universe in a non-dual state and just being in divine peace and equanimity. Shakti, on the other hand, is enlightened energy. It's part of, it moves, it's dynamic, it's the flow of phenomena. And an aspect of the flow of phenomena is samsara, ignorant participation in relativity, just like there's ignorant Shiva or consciousness and misunderstandings of the way things are. But there's an enlightened version of mind, which is Shiva, which is pure wisdom consciousness, and there's an enlightened version of phenomena, of movement, of body and time and space and dramas and energy. And that's Shakti, that's illumined spiritual energy. Well, it's this energy that was abused. Shakti was misused. And so, in a sense, a deep unconscious fear of Shakti developed as a result of that disaster. And so it led to a lot of patriarchal traditions tending to saying, that's dangerous, we're not going to go there. The feminine is dangerous. And a lot of this is subconscious. It's not like anybody, in the current cycle of the last nobody remembered the Martuk disaster. It wasn't a conscious thing. It was just a deep trauma and an imbalance. Humanity became profoundly burdened, and the planet as a whole, really, by this disaster that happened. It was one of the things that I experienced was an enormous sorrow. Not only was there guilt and horror and even anger and blaming, and it was a very complicated sort of planetary-wide reaction, even beyond the planet. But also a huge part of it was a tremendous sense of sorrow, and that sorrow came down like a blanket over the earth and caused everything to feel denser and more a sense of losing touch, of being veiled by that. And in that veiling, there's anytime you add another veil, another level of ignorance, another level, things fracture more, things get less. So less harmony between the male and the female, more confusion, more lack of mutual understanding, more fear. So this is the short version. So in essence, these are some of the key dynamics that have led to everything from overly masculine and ascending spiritual lineages to, to the struggles between genders in day-to-day life and so on, and socially and so on and so forth. That's part of what I mean by the new archetype that's being born. It's born of a profoundly, deepened realization of the radical interdependence of male and female, and the vast implications of what that really means. It's one thing to say that abstractly, but the more deeply intuitively we understand that, the more we can look at all kinds of things about our spiritual traditions, how we approach spiritual practice, kinds of practices we do, things in our day-to-day culture, how we live as human beings. For instance, just to give you an example, it's a very common thing in non-dual teachings, which purport to be non-dual, like not preferring male or female. And nonetheless, they regularly refer to awareness or consciousness as the ultimate principle. That non-dualism is consciousness. But consciousness is half of the equation. It's Shiva. It's the masculine principle. The other is Shakti, that energy that is part of the flow of life. Both married non-dually is the wholeness of human enlightenment. So the tradition on the one hand says, well, we're non-dual. We're, in a sense, the one implication of that is we're not gender biased. And then they turn around and say, and enlightenment is pure consciousness. That actually is falling back into a gender bias, because that isn't a complete description, and it has implications to keep saying that. It impacts us as human beings to think of enlightenment in those terms. So these are the kinds of changes that I see happening as a more profound understanding of the way we've been conditioned by these things and what the new spirituality looks like, which is born out of the suffering, born out of the healing that we're going through in our times. And even if, worst case scenario, humanity doesn't survive in this cycle that much longer, enormous wisdom will have come out of what we've gone through, and a great healing, especially one that will have been assimilated into our souls in the inner dimensions, and that will have changed humanity so that in the next cycle we'll be reborn in a new spirit. But I'm still hopeful, as I said before, that we can pull this off. We can make it through this crisis, and we can find a kind of continuity of harmony and integration that will survive the stress of this healing crisis and allow us to continue on for a period of time. I see much. I guess we're gone over for quite a bit, but I saw one more question come in. Just a request. Okay.
Mark, do you have? Can I ask a question?
There we go. And yes, go ahead.
Yeah. It was. I've noticed also that the prophecies, so to speak, have kind of not been true from about the beginning of the 1990s or something like that. So what happened in the 1980s that was kind of changing it, and what change do we see today as a result of that?
I can't really speak at this point about what happened specifically. All I can say is that an unexpected positive event took place in the late 20th century that opened up the possibility of a deeper, increased the likelihood of a fuller embrace of this possibility. But if we imagine a kind of a spectrum where the middle of the spectrum is kind of like the middle hoped for scenario. If you go into that situation and you initiate attempting to push that to a greater outcome, let's see if we can accelerate world awakening and bring about a more complete insight, a more complete fulfillment, more complete healing. You also, in a sense, stir things up. Again, this is something that we'll go into a little bit more detail in the next couple of meetings, but it's like for any ideal to be expressed in human nature, you have to go through the healing process and the experiences and a transformation that is the story of how that ideal is brought into expression. That's why human beings don't just simply arrive in their first incarnation and turn into masters. A master is made. A human being is seated with the ideal that they will become a master. That is built into our souls, that's the purpose of our human experiences, that we will attain the state of liberated mastery. And then everything that we go through in all those incarnations are the necessary experiences that we have to go through in order to realize that. That's how we get the wisdom that manifests that ideal mastery. So if you seed in a person, for instance, the ideal that they won't just become a master, they're going to become a Buddha, that means they have to go through more experiences to realize that. It's a richer karmic and evolutionary history that being has to go through to realize that fulfillment. This event that happened in the late 20th century kind of tweaked a notch upward the potential possibility of the fullness of the spirit of emergence and revelation and transformation that's possible in the opportunity that we're in the midst of right now. But that also caused an intensification of karma that needs to come up, that needs to be healed. So on an objective level, it felt like things got worse. But that's actually because things were, the positive potential of the situation was intensified a notch, you might say. So that's all I'm going to say about that at the moment, for various reasons, including that we're kind of out of time. And so we'll have to hold some of that till later to go into a little more. So thank you for all your questions. They've been very...
Mark, can I just mention, thank you very much for opening up the bag. It's very interesting now. I've been waiting for this for a long time. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for opening up.
Okay, good. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. Well, yeah, thank you all for coming. And have a good week, and I look forward to seeing you next Sunday. Also, a reminder, remember the time changes next week because of the whole daylight savings time thing. So if I included, as you might remember, in the email that I sent out with the link, so you can go back there if you need to refer to that and just refresh your memory. So see you all next week.